So, what do you see as challenges that journalists are facing in Nigeria?
I think the biggest challenge is that of repression of freedom of expression in society. So you have a society where the government, either civilian or military, doesn't want people to express themselves, and there are also journalists whose job is to help them express themselves in the best way possible. So the environment is just unsuitable, where the society is kind of closed. No matter what people say about Nigeria and the advent of democracy, it's still a closed society. And then you have the general economic problems facing everybody because 70% of the country lives in $1 per day, and I think maybe journalists live on $5 per day. So there's poverty surrounding the journalists and also poverty confronting them. But the most troublesome part of it is ownership of media in the country. Though Nigeria is deregulated, most of the media is no longer owned by the government, but it is people in government who have been involved in large-scale corruption that now controls majority of the print and electronic media. So they determine who is their editors and what the newspapers can write and what they cannot write. And in most cases, they just let the newspapers exist at their convenience. So I think that's actually the biggest challenge is ownership.
So, then, if a journalist does try to write a story, if they try to do some sort of serious investigation, let's say they found some sort of corruption and they want to tell the story, um, what is that experience going to be like for them? I mean, is it possible for them to publish that?
Well, in some cases, I have to say also as caveat that the Nigerian media is a very, very vibrant media. They came from a tradition of resisting military rule and even publishing against decrees that were established to promulgated to proscribe most of them. So there's a bit of history of courage there. But this courage pales into insignificance when you have to deal with informal means of repression that are frequently employed by politicians who are now the ruling elite in Nigeria. Before, the military came after people directly. You saw the secret police come after you. But these days, it's a mix. You have the secret police still doing, coming after people, they arrest, they raid newspaper printing press, and then you have the people within the fringes of society, like armed robbers, gangs, and hired assassins who just came after people. And a society that doesn't have a police that can protect its own or investigate cases or crimes of assassination or hits carried out on critical journalists. You know, Journalists are left at the mercy of one having to self-censor. They might have a powerful investigation report in front of them, and then they have to deal with, do we publish this? Because what happens after this is published? So you have a situation where they are self-censoring. Secondly, Nigeria has a terrible judiciary too. In such an extent that if you look at Nigerian media today, a lot of the journalists who have written even correct stories that brought before judges who try to bankrupt the newspapers by awarding frivolous judgments in favor of the politicians. Because most of the state governors, for example, who have been at the center of huge corrupt activities in the last 8 years that Nigeria returned back to democratic rule, control the judges. They are the chief security officers of their state. They are the chief judicial officers of their state, as far as I'm concerned. They decide which judges become chief judge, and they directly control the judges. And the federal high courts and the Supreme Court are not better either. In my own, that's just my opinion. So you have tons and tons of lawsuits, against newspapers. Even if they don't award damages against you, you have to pay your lawyers who are paying court every day. And if a newspaper house has over 20 cases of libel hanging on their neck, and they have to send lawyers to court every week. That's a huge bill right there to contend with. That also forces a lot of people into self-censorship. In a country where leaders have no respect for laws, you can't even talk about legal protection. Because, I mean, the Nigerian Constitution means nothing. It's worth nothing to the Nigerian leaders. So, but also, most of the protection for journalism in Nigeria comes from the 1960 laws. It's still the British laws. It's the British way of doing things. In fact, the Senate President of Nigeria was calling last week for there to be criminalization of libel. That if you libel somebody in government, you can go to jail for it instead of paying civil penalties if they win against you. So it tells you the mindset that is in place and the laws that are there. But also, most importantly, Nigeria doesn't have a Freedom of Information Act or law in place. So you don't have any official means or ways of even getting information from the government. And a lot of information in Nigeria is also classified as secret. As a matter of fact, last week, the president of Nigeria, quote and unquote, collected all his aides and swore them to an oath of secrecy, so that they will prevent any leakage of information, either official or unofficial, to the media out there. So when you have these contradictory processes in place, targeted at the media in particular, you would have just a useless and worthless media in place. And I am not satisfied with the resistance that is coming from the media people themselves, and it comes back to ownership again. And the owners just determine what the practitioners or the journalists do. But most importantly, the society is corrupt. And a corrupt leadership, a corrupt judiciary, and corrupt police, and also corrupt executive branch would ultimately corrupt journalists. So you must have heard a lot of stories about Nigerian journalists collecting brown envelopes from politicians. Those directly influence how our stories are finally delivered. But to go back to your point, and directly, I think over the years, a lot of factors have come together, combined themselves together, and waged, a deteriorating struggle on journalism in Nigeria. And a lot of it is also the making of the journalists themselves, because they just allow themselves to be controlled by the vagaries of the environment in which they find themselves. Because I always say that a journalist is as good as his God, first and foremost, before his training and intellect. I actually used to love the media so much in Nigeria, especially under the military rule, that I wish that we could just have the media run the government for us. Because there was a lot of sound analysis, they were very critical, and they were not afraid. This was up until the time that the media ownership changed, because most of the newspapers that were existing under military were spin-offs of people who worked within the mainstream media. Their bosses were misbehaving, and they went and set up what they call guerrilla journalism centers, and they will publish and circulate. When the government will go and raid them, they'll get one last copy out and they photocopy it and sell it on the street. People didn't care. So I used to really, really hope for, a strong media, and I could care less if we had a strong government, because I know that the strong media can make the government work. If there's anything the Nigerian government is afraid of, even up until tomorrow, it is the media. They're not afraid of the United Nations. They're not afraid of the US, because they have oil to sell them, and they keep quiet over human rights abuses. But they really are afraid of independent media. And you could tell how they come after newspapers each time there's a big story coming out, or how they try to suppress information from coming out. So, but all of that is changing because, like I said, I think the media gave away its power, or they fought like really terrible military governments, guys who carried guns, take over their offices. Some of the offices were closed down for 6 months, 1 year. They could care less. They kept publishing. They were not afraid. And then we don't have those direct, crazy kind of repression anymore, but there seems to have been a retreat, in responsible media.